Okie dokie. I really struggled to figure out kind of how to talk about testimony. I distinctly remember at one point I was on a missions trip, and the lady who was leading the missions trip, she asked us all to give our testimonies. And when I went to give mine, I was actually requested not to give mine because I didn't have a strong enough testimony. Because I hadn't lived long enough at that point. I think I was 15. And I was so struck by it that I didn't have a testimony that I thought I had to go find a testimony. I didn't. My mother was angry on my behalf that someone told that to me. And I've grown now to understand that testimony is just your story and what has God done for you, and how does that help other people understand maybe their relationship with God. So I will do my best to just tell my story, and trust that that is enough. So I was born and raised in Colorado Springs, which is a pretty stereotypical Midwestern town in the US. We're now a city. We were a town when I was born. We're the number 3 place in the US to live. Everyone loves it. It's beautiful. My family moved there. I'm a first-generation American. My dad is from London and my mom is from Sweden, and they met in YWAM, Youth with a Mission. They were doing missions all through their early years. And most of my life, my young life, consisted of missionary work. I thought that was everyone's norm. In Colorado Springs, I lived with my 2 parents, my brother and my sister, and then my mom's entire family, who were from Sweden, Ukraine, the Bahamas. We all managed to all live together in the same city, which meant I was raised with my cousins and my uncle and my grandparents in a very tight community, a very important family unit to me. Most of my life, my faith was based on my family's faith. It was tied to stories that I'd heard growing up. My grandfather used to tell a story of when he was crossing the border into China at one point in his life, and he was carrying Bibles, and they were in the back of in the trunk, in the boot. And as they were crossing the border, they got stopped, and the border patrol, they said, you have to hand over the Bibles. And at this point it was illegal. And my grandfather said, we don't have Bibles. And they said, no, we know you have Bibles because I had a dream last night and an angel said you were bringing me a Bible. I need the Bible you have for me. And my grandfather said, oh, yes, I do have the Bibles, and brings out the Bibles and gives them to the border control. And then he keeps going. There were hundreds of stories like that from my grandfather. My father accidentally healed a woman of a jaw injury. He had a word of knowledge and accidentally healed someone. My mother was almost hit by a bus, but by a strange series of events, managed to not be hit by said bus. And I feel like these stories of my family go on forever. I just have hundreds and hundreds of things that I was raised on of my immediate family. And my faith was so intertwined with that. It made my childhood such a secure place that I knew that the fantastical was so normal, that the miraculous was every day, and I just wasn't there yet. My grandfather was the head of the International Bible Society for a very long time. I don't know how many years, but after he finished at the International Bible Society, he started a nonprofit called Global Action, where we worked with underprivileged youth, orphans, widows, and the homeless in underdeveloped areas, primarily in Ukraine and India and Uganda. And my life was spent with people from other countries coming into my home, staying with us, learning about their cultures and about their understanding of God. And again, I just thought that was every day. I thought everyone would have conversations with their parents about what sort of shoes you can and can't wear depending on who was staying with you, because that sort of thing matters in culture. Because of the presence of this nonprofit, Global Action, every weekend, my holidays were spent volunteering, sort of forced by my parents, but not really. We all loved it. It was like a playground. We could pretend we were corporate workers as we wrote the envelopes and wrote the thank yous to the patrons. And my brother's 13th birthday, what he wanted to do to celebrate was he wanted to go and package off gifts that were being sent from this nonprofit. So that's what we did. I just think that's so cute. But it was so normal. And it really built this support for me that I knew God was there for me, even if I didn't have my own story. And even with a really involved Christian family, we left going to church when I was about 14 years old. My brother and I were mercilessly bullied by our youth groups. My brother, because he was kind of a gangly looking guy, a little weird, and he had funny ways of explaining things, and so he got bullied. I got bullied because I wasn't pretty, and I was very intellectual, which wasn't cool. So I got bullied. And I told my dad I wanted to leave, and we did. But we didn't stop doing church. My dad has a master's in theology, so he decided we were going to do a house church, which turned out being one of the biggest stones on my base as a Christian, because this home church consisted of families and with kids ranging from 3 to, I think my brother when we started was 16, and then my parents' friends and then their friends' friends. And so we had ages 3 to about 80 at one point. And we would all discuss, everyone was involved. 14-year-old me could have opinions and thoughts and discuss things, and that would be respected as much as my dad, who had his master's. And I quickly learned that everyone's story has something to tell. It was around this time that I said, I don't think I need to read the Bible. I found reading the Bible very unhelpful, is what I said. Really what I meant was, I don't want to read the Bible. That's a lot of work. And I didn't, and I was fine. You know, I still believed in God, and I still knew he could do miraculous things, and I still had my family's faith to hold on to. My senior year of high school, I decided I was going to go into theater. At the time, I didn't really know why I was going into theater. I just knew that I liked it. Now I can see that God has been slowly guiding me there for a long time. But at the time, I was just doing what I love. And my family, being the supportive family it was and is, supported me the whole way. But that summer, starting my first year at uni, my mom was rushed to the hospital all of a sudden, out of nowhere. And overnight was diagnosed with a rare form of ovarian cancer. And they gave it a pre-terminal diagnosis, meaning if they hadn't caught it at the moment they did, it would have been terminal. But they caught it early enough that they might be able to get rid of it. So we started chemo my freshman year of uni. I was 17, and I was my mom's primary caretaker. That meant that my daily routine was I would get up around 5, shower, have my own breakfast, maybe get a little homework in before I would help my mom get up. I'd bathe her, I'd get her breakfast. I would normally see if she needed anything else before some other family member would be able to come and take over. And then I would go to school because I was at school full time. And then I was working 2 jobs. So I'd go to my jobs. And then the next day I would do the same. All during this time, I didn't cry. I didn't really have time to cry, is what I told myself. I do think you can make time to cry. I was not making time to cry. I was doing everything possible not to have time to cry, because if I started crying, I wasn't really sure I would ever stop. I'm gonna take a moment. In Psalms, there is a wonderful, wonderful poem, Psalm 42, that is full of ups and downs. It is full of celebrations and lamentations, and it's so delicately interwoven that it seems as one. one of those passages says, "My tears have been my food day and night, while people say to me all day long, 'Where is your God?' These things I remember as I pour out my soul. How I used to go to the house of God under the protection of the Mighty One, with shouts of joy and praise among the festive throng. Why, my soul, are you downcast? Why so disturbed within me?" This sorrow became my normal. It's all I knew for a very long time. I began to go to church again about a year later, wanting to try to find how to not be so sad. I was also feeling a lot of guilt. I was in a show that I had to wear lingerie and dance on stage. And I thought maybe if I went to church, God wouldn't be so pissed at me for giving lap dances to strangers. I've now reconciled that with myself. I actually don't think he was pissed at me for that at all. The show ended up being beautiful and told the most Christian story out of any show I've ever told. But as I went to church and tried to unsadden myself, I ended up falling in love with the worship pastor of my church, much to the dismay of my parents. And it wasn't that they were just unhappy with their girl finding someone, but I became very secluded. I wouldn't spend so much time at home. And my sadness just kept getting deeper. And it didn't seem to be going anywhere other than down. The summer of 2017, my boyfriend proposed to me, and I said yes. A couple weeks later, I learned how to tie a noose for a class I was in, and it became a habit. I would sit with rope in my hand and I would just tie a noose. It was almost like a twitch. That was what I would do. If I was nervous, I'd tie a noose, and I was like, oh, I feel so much better now. I was then in a show that required this absurd character wears a noose around their neck the whole show, and only speaks nonsense. And it's a very depressing play. And I would wear this noose every night. I was also on an outreach team for the students that would take the incoming students and help them get integrated on campus. And in order to prepare for this, I did some training on mental health. And we did this kind of seminar where we looked at suicide. And there was these check boxes you could go down. And if you were looking at a student, you could go through them and say, okay, could they be suicidal? And I'm in the class and the lady was like, let's do it on ourselves. I was like, oh, yay. And I go down the list and check each one. And I just stared at that paper and was so confused, because though I had been all this sadness, I never would have said I was a sad person or a depressed person, and certainly not suicidal. After all, I had a wonderful family. I was engaged. I was a great student. I had a job. I had a home. There was no reason for me to be depressed. I pulled out of that class, realizing that I couldn't really be student outreach if I needed to find help. So I started seeing a therapist and was beginning to understand that maybe I was a little depressed. I couldn't figure out what was causing that. And I couldn't really talk to my parents about it because my parents and I were at constant odds, because I was engaged to someone they didn't approve of. And I could not understand why, because he was perfect to me. He was lovely. He understood me. And he would always make sure that nothing could get to me, that if I found something upsetting, he would help it. A couple of months into my therapy, I started taking medication. And as soon as I started taking the medication, I realized that I was really unhappy because of my relationship, and that I didn't want to be in that relationship anymore. And every time I would speak with my fiance about it, he became aggressive, and that aggression turned into abuse. And I sat for about 9 months in an abusive relationship trying to figure out, how do I leave, especially when I still loved him. But I continued at my church and I talked with my pastor and I said, I don't really know what to do. I'm not happy in this relationship, and I want to leave. And I don't know why I'm so sad. And he was like, well, maybe this relationship isn't very good for you. And you're probably going through a lot of grief right now. And I couldn't see the grief. All I could see was sadness. In that psalm, Psalm 42, there's a section where David says, I say to God, my rock, why have you forgotten me? Why must I go about mourning, oppressed by the enemy? My bones suffer mortal agony as my foes taunt me, saying to me all day long, where is your God? And I just kept thinking over and over to myself, where did God go? How did I end up in this relationship? And why has he left me? And then on top of that, the physical abuse had made me feel gross. I didn't feel clean anymore, and I didn't feel worthy even of God, even if he had answered me. I write poetry, and I'm going to share one of the poems I wrote at that time, which echoes David, as I read a lot of Psalms. Lord, my shepherd, you have forgotten me. Never have I wandered from your flock, constantly near to your crook. My fleece remains matted, and I am unfit for your company. I call out your holy name, but am met with overwhelming silence. Begging for mercy, I ask for rescue, my selfish heart yearning for your hand. Yet I remain in a thronged mass, and now turn to the answer of wolves. Perhaps then I will feel your protection, or else be devoured by hounds. Oh, my Lord, why have you deserted me thus? During all of this, my mom was also going through our third round of chemo. Cancer was a constant, which is a grief that is constantly building and billowing and sits with you all the time, and it never leaves. A friend of mine described it like a box, and in this box, there's a sphere, and as it bounces around, it touches the sides, and each time it touches the sides, you feel grief. And as time passes, your box grows, and the grief, it doesn't shrink, but your box is bigger, so you don't feel it as much. But with cancer, the box doesn't grow, not until the person has died or the cancer's gone away. And I had gotten so used to that box that I couldn't realize that you shouldn't feel that sad all the time. I sat with my grandfather one day because he was my mentor. My family was this strong clan. And I said, I don't know what to do. I don't want to break up with him. I still love him. And he essentially said, I know you love him, but he doesn't love you in the way you love him, and you need to leave. And I was ripped up, and I was like, I don't know what to do. In big epic stories, this is where the person goes on like a soul searching hike. So I went for a soul searching hike, and I was determined. I was gonna pray this whole time. And so I started walking down this path and kept telling myself, I can't get distracted. I have to pray. And I started to pray, God, I just want to be happy again. I just want to be laughing again. I don't even remember the last time I laughed. And as I'm thinking this, a spider runs out in front of me. For most people, maybe that's a moment of shock, a moment of moving back. But it was March, and I love spiders, and I hadn't seen a spider in about 6 months. And I completely threw off any idea of prayer and bent over and started gazing at the spider, remembering praying. I stood back up and was like, oh, that's right, gotta pray. I keep walking and I'm praying. And then another spider runs out in front of me, and I'm like, this is the best day ever. I look at the spider and I'm like, oh, I gotta pray. So I keep walking and praying. I'm like, maybe that was a sign. It's like, I don't know any Bible verses with a spider. So I keep walking and I walk along this riverside and I find an area with stones and like long reeds and marshes. And I sit there in these big grasses and I was like, okay, I'm going to pray. Maybe that spider was a sign. And I could not get the spider out of my head. So I was like, yeah, I'm just going to Google it. I'm going to Google verses about spiders. There's two. So I just clicked on the first one and it's from Job 8. And as I read it, I felt everything in me seep out through my body because I had never felt so heard in my life. Through Job 8, it talks about why it's one of Job's friends telling him, you got to stop whining. But it wasn't the context that was important. God used these words to just tell me he was there. It started by saying, he will surely rise up and restore your happy home. Just ask the previous generation. Pay attention to the experience of our ancestors. And me sitting there having just talked with my grandfather was like, ah! It then goes on to say, can papyrus reeds grow tall without a marsh? Can marsh grass flourish without water? And the whole section is talking about the marshes, which I'm literally surrounded by. And then it gets down to saying, don't trust people who don't have hope in God. Their confidence hangs by a thread, and they are leaning on a spider's web. And the talk of hope had been something that my fiance would often say, I don't have hope in God, I don't need that. And then this section in Job finishes off with, he will once again fill your mouth with laughter and your lips with shouts of joy. This moment with God gave me enough courage to break up with my fiance and to end that relationship. Once I did that, I was able to completely renew my own life. It was like, now that that was gone, I had all this space to grow and I didn't even realize. That summer, I spent hours and hours in a garden just pruning raspberry plants and singing and crying and laughing. And I had this hunger for God that I'd never had before. In Psalm 42, in the interweaving of woes and joys, David says, as the deer pants for streams of water, so my soul pants for you. My soul thirsts for God, for the living God. Where can I go and meet with God? And I kept asking that, where can I go? There's got to be somewhere I can go to find him. And I was praying and I felt like God said London. I was like, oh, that's real cool. I don't live in London. And then I got accepted into a prestigious drama school, Lambda in London. And I moved to London temporarily because I wasn't a citizen. When I got there, I said, God, I really wish we could stay. And he said, well, we are staying. It's like, that's silly. I can't stay. So I did a little Google search. And since the time it had taken for me to leave the US and land in the UK, a new law had been passed that meant anyone born within a certain 5 years outside of the UK, but had a parent from the UK, was a UK citizen by default. And I fell into that. So I just had to claim my citizenship, and I did. And I have stayed in London. Well, in and out. If you remember from when my mom was first diagnosed with cancer, I didn't cry at all. Many of you will find that as a surprise because I don't think many of you haven't seen me tearful. But really, I didn't cry in front of people ever. And working in drama school completely ripped that apart. I remember walking with groceries in my hands and I came across this rose bush that was so beautiful. I just lost it. Cried for like an hour about this rose bush that was astonishingly beautiful. And I was like, who am I? How did this happen? And I felt like God and I really began to talk in a way that I'd never spoken with him before, where I could speak and he would speak back. And I would never know when he would speak, but it would be so obvious when he did. I I was praying one morning and talking about, oh, this is great. We're so close. I love this so much. And out of nowhere, he was like, you have to find a church. And I was completely taken aback by it because I was like, well, I'm happy. We're doing great. So I started searching for a church and I didn't have much luck. Every church I went to reminded me of the ones where I got bullied. And I was like, I just don't think this is for me. And one day, as I was lying on my bed, having had a crying fit, which is a norm for me now, I was scrolling through Facebook and some like suggested for you video came up, and it was one of the Jolly videos with Chris in it. I don't remember which one it was, but I remember seeing Chris talking and going, that vicar, I think, might know a church that would work for me. I'm going to contact him and see if he has a suggestion for a church that I might be able to gel with. Quick Google search, turns out it was around the corner. So my first Sunday at St Saviour's, I walked in and was greeted by this joyful woman who was just like the most welcoming human I'd ever met. And I felt this feeling of I've come home. This is something I didn't know I needed. And everyone was welcoming and everyone was so kind. And I cried. And it was the first time I had cried in front of so many people. And I remember Elia pulled out some tissues from her bag and handed them to me. I think Lauren prayed for me that day, and I ended up spending the entire day with church members. Since joining St. Saviour's, my growth with God has become that interweaving. It's no longer just sadness, and it's no longer just joy, but it's both. There's this wonderful, wonderful small stanza in Psalm 42 where David says, deep calls to deep. In the roar of your waterfalls, all your waves and breakers have swept over me. By day, the Lord directs his love. At night, his song is with me, a prayer to the God of my life. It's that joyful wanting God and finding him, and he just wraps around you. And that's what St. Saviour's has been to me. This place where I've met people who have God in them. There's been so many times where I've looked at people in church or I've asked a question, and when they turn to answer me, their eyes aren't their own. And it's this moment of knowing that this community I've found and am now a part of is so interwoven with the Spirit that I get to experience God every day through people, not just on my own time. 2020 has been wild. This is my first year out of school. I love school. And so it's been really weird. And then, of course, coronavirus. I ended up in the States for 6 months. I haven't been able to work in the theater because my industry isn't really being able to work right now. And my mom's health has been deteriorating at a faster rate than the rest of cancer time. And a lot of the time is spent grieving. A lot of the time is spent asking, why, oh, why my soul, why am I so downcast? Why is this so hard? But I'm constantly reminded, especially with Psalm 42, that interweaving of joy and grief is one of the wonderful gifts of God, that I get to have that through this grief, through this sadness, there's also joy, and that the two don't have to exist in different worlds, but that they're in the same place. And I'm just so grateful for that. So I'm going to finish with one of the last parts of Psalm 42, which is, why, my soul, are you so downcast? Why so disturbed within me? Put your hope in God, for I will yet praise him, my Savior and my God. That's my story, guys.